Welcome to today's gripping story that will leave you questioning trust, loyalty, and the lengths one father will go to protect his family. Chris thought his life was perfect, until a shocking affair unraveled lies, betrayal, and chaos. With his children's future at stake, he's pulled into a bitter battle against deceit and manipulation. Stay tuned as we dive into this emotional rollercoaster of infidelity, resilience, and the ultimate fight for stability. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on more incredible stories like this one. Our protagonist, Chris, was an easygoing, affable guy in his early 30s, the kind of man everyone described as solid. He wasn't flashy or dramatic, just steady. He worked as an operations manager for a logistics company, which meant long hours, spreadsheets, and the occasional warehouse hiccup outside work. He was a devoted husband to Emily, his wife of 7 years. Emily was the type of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, juggling her career with taking care of their 2 young kids, Lily, who was 6, and Jack, only 3. Together, they seemed like the picture of suburban bliss. At least, that's what their friends and neighbors believed. But behind closed doors, life wasn't so picture-perfect. Chris had started to notice changes in Emily. At first, they were subtle, like her tendency to check her phone a little too often. He brushed it off, thinking, everyone's glued to their screens these days. But then, there were other things. She seemed distant, her usual warmth replaced with a sense of detachment that Chris couldn't quite put his finger on. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching their favorite TV show, Emily's phone buzzed. Chris glanced over. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh she used to reserve just for him. "Who's that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just Sophie," Emily replied, naming her best friend from college. Her tone was light, dismissive. Even Chris nodded, letting it go. After all, Sophie was her oldest friend. Why wouldn't they chat? But something about the way Emily locked her phone and placed it face down on the coffee table sent a ripple of unease through Chris. If you'd seen them at the neighborhood block party that weekend, you never would have guessed anything was wrong. Chris was flipping burgers on the grill, laughing at jokes with the neighbors. Emily stood nearby, chatting with a group of moms about a new yoga studio opening downtown. Lily and Jack were playing tag with the other kids, their laughter ringing out in the warm summer air. To the outside world, the Taylors were the epitome of a happy family, but Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wanted to believe that the distance between them was just a phase. Maybe Emily was stressed. Maybe they both were. 2 kids, demanding jobs, and a mortgage didn't exactly leave room for romantic date nights or lazy mornings in bed. Still, Chris couldn't ignore the small moments that chipped away at his confidence, like when Emily started coming home later than usual, claiming she'd lost track of time at the grocery store or while running errands, or the way she'd started dressing up more, wearing outfits she hadn't touched in years. One night, as she stood in front of the mirror applying lipstick before a supposed girls' night out, Chris couldn't help but ask, "You're looking fancy. Where are you going again?" Emily barely glanced at him. "Just meeting Sophie at that wine bar downtown. We're overdue for some girl time." Chris nodded, forcing a smile. But as the front door clicked shut behind her, he felt a gnawing sense of unease. It was a Saturday morning when Chris stumbled across the first clue. Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter. While she took the kids to a birthday party, Chris was wiping down the counters when the screen lit up with a notification. New message from Greg. Chris froze. Greg wasn't a name he recognized. It wasn't one of Emily's co-workers or the parents from their kids' school. Curiosity burned in his chest, but he hesitated. He wasn't the type to snoop. But then he remembered the little lies, the laughter that wasn't meant for him anymore, and the way she avoided his gaze when he asked about her plans. His hand hovered over the phone. One quick glance wouldn't hurt, right? The message preview read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." Chris's stomach dropped. The words blurred together as a wave of nausea swept over him. He set the phone down as if it had burned him, his mind racing. Was this what he thought it was? Was he jumping to conclusions? When Emily returned home later that afternoon, Chris couldn't look at her the same way. She was all smiles, chatting about how much fun Lily and Jack had at the party. Chris nodded along, His responses clipped and automatic. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, tilting her head in concern. "Yeah, fine," Chris lied, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Over the next few days, Chris became hyper-aware of everything Emily did. He noticed how she seemed to guard her phone more carefully, how her excuses for being out of the house grew flimsier. He replayed their conversations in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. One evening, as Emily prepared for yet another girls' night, Chris decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Emily," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Can we talk?" She turned to him, her expression neutral. "What's up?" Chris hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to ask her outright about Greg, but something held him back. Instead, he said, "I feel like we're not as close as we used to be. Like there's this distance between us." Emily frowned, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Chris, we've been married for 7 years. Of course things feel different. That's just life." "But it's more than that," he pressed. "You've been acting distant." Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Look, I've been stressed, okay? Between work, the kids, and everything else, I'm just tired. Can we not do this right now?" Chris nodded, swallowing his frustration. He wanted to believe her, but the nagging doubt in his mind refused to let go. Over the next week, Chris wrestled with his suspicions. Part of him wanted to confront Emily directly, to demand answers, but another part feared what he might uncover. What if he was wrong? What if he destroyed their marriage over a misunderstanding? Late one night, unable to sleep, Chris sat in the living room staring at Emily's phone on the coffee table. His hands itched to pick it up, to search for the truth. But instead, he grabbed his laptop and started researching. If something was going on, he needed proof, not just for himself, but for the sake of their kids. And so, the wheels were set in motion. Chris didn't know what he would find or how far it would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore the cracks in their perfect life any longer. Chris had spent the week carefully observing Emily. If she noticed his growing unease, she didn't show it. Every evening, she went about her routine with the same casual detachment. But to Chris, every interaction felt like a game of chess, one where he was perpetually a move behind. It was Friday night when things took a sharper turn. Emily had come home later than usual, her cheeks flushed, claiming she'd been catching up with Sophie. She kissed the kids goodnight before retreating upstairs to shower. Chris sat in the living room staring at her phone again. It was like a silent accusation lying there on the counter. This time he didn't hesitate. Unlocking it, he scrolled through her messages until he saw the thread with Greg. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit plans for their next meeting. Compliments on her dress from earlier that week, and then, the line that sent a chill down Chris's spine. "I can't wait to see you at the cabin this weekend. It's all I've been thinking about." The cabin. What cabin? They didn't own a cabin. Chris's mind raced. He locked the phone and set it back in its place just as Emily came down the stairs, her damp hair falling loosely over her shoulders. "You okay?" she asked, her tone casual, almost disinterested. Chris stood, his heart pounding. He didn't want to blow up, not with the kids asleep upstairs, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "Emily, who's Greg?" Her face froze for a fraction of a second before she forced a laugh. "Greg, what are you talking about?" "I saw the messages," Chris said, his voice low but firm. "Don't lie to me." Emily's eyes narrowed, her arms crossing defensively. "You went through my phone?" "That's your takeaway?" Chris asked, his frustration bubbling over. "You've been sneaking around, messaging this guy, planning trips to some cabin, and you're mad I looked at your phone?" Emily sighed, her expression shifting to exasperation. "Greg is just a friend, Chris. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "A friend?" Chris echoed, incredulous. "Friends don't talk like that." Emily shook her head, brushing past him. "I can't believe this. You're being paranoid." But Chris wasn't buying it. For the first time in their marriage, he felt like he didn't know the woman standing in front of him. "If there's nothing going on," he said, his voice trembling with anger and hurt, "then prove it. Show me the messages." Emily froze, her hand resting on the banister. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said finally. "If you can't trust me, that's your problem." And with that, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving Chris alone in the silence of their once happy home. The next day, Chris couldn't shake the conversation. Emily's refusal to explain only confirmed his worst fears. But what could he do? He felt stuck, trapped between wanting to protect their marriage and knowing it might already be too late. Over breakfast, Emily acted like nothing had happened. She chatted with the kids, laughed at their jokes, and even offered Chris a smile or two. But to him, it all felt hollow, like a performance. Later that afternoon, while the kids napped, Chris called his best friend, Mark. If anyone could give him advice, it was Mark. They'd been friends since college, the kind of friends who could read each other's moods with a glance. "Mark," Chris began, pacing the living room, "I think Emily's cheating on me." There was a long pause on the other end. "Cheating? Are you sure?" "I saw messages," Chris admitted, his voice tight. "They weren't just friendly." Mark sighed. "Man, I don't even know what to say. Have you confronted her?" "I tried," Chris said. "She just brushed it off, said I was being paranoid." Mark was silent for a moment before responding. "Look, if you really think something's going on, you need proof, solid proof. Otherwise, it's just your word against hers." Chris nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. Proof, that was the key, but how far was he willing to go to get it? That evening, Chris made a decision. He'd always thought private investigators was something you only saw in movies or TV dramas, but desperate times called for desperate measures. After some quick research, he found a local investigator named Jennifer, whose reviews touted her discretion and professionalism. When Chris met Jennifer the next day, he laid everything out: the messages, the distance, the lies. She listened intently, jotting down notes as he spoke. "This Greg," she said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Do you know anything about him, last name, where he works?" Chris shook his head. "Nothing, just his first name." Jennifer nodded. "That's okay. I'll start with the messages and go from there. If she's meeting him at this cabin, we'll find out." Chris left the meeting feeling equal parts nervous and relieved. He didn't want to be the kind of man who spied on his wife, but he also couldn't ignore the knot in his stomach any longer. A week later, Jennifer called. "We need to meet," she said, her tone serious. "I've found something you need to see." Chris's heart raced as he drove to Jennifer's office. When he arrived, she handed him a folder filled with photos and documents. There was Emily, smiling brightly, walking arm in arm with a man who could only be Greg. The photos showed them at a cozy lakeside cabin, their body language leaving no room for doubt. Another image captured them, laughing over wine on the cabin's deck. Jennifer had also compiled receipts and text transcripts, evidence that left no room for interpretation. Chris stared at the photos, his hands trembling. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I knew something was going on." Jennifer placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Chris. I know this isn't easy, but now you have the truth." Chris left Jennifer's office feeling numb. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. But as the initial shock wore off, a new emotion took its place: determination. If Emily thought she could tear their family apart without consequences, she was wrong. At home, he poured himself a drink, staring at the evidence spread out on the kitchen table. He thought about Lily and Jack, about the life he'd worked so hard to build. They deserved better than this. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Chris knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let Emily's choices destroy his family. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories like this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do in Chris's situation? Stay tuned for the next chapter in this story. Chris knew the truth now, but knowing and confronting it were two entirely different things. The weight of betrayal sat heavily on his chest as he stared at the photos spread across the dining table. Emily wasn't just a little distant or preoccupied, she was leading a double life. And now, Chris had a choice to make: confront her and risk a volatile fallout, or wait and gather more evidence to protect himself and his kids. For a moment he thought of Lily and Jack, tucked safely in their beds upstairs. Their laughter, their trust. It was for them that he resolved to confront Emily, no matter how painful it might be. That night, Chris waited until the kids were asleep. He paced the living room, rehearsing what he would say, how he would keep his anger in check. When Emily walked through the front door, her bright smile faltered as she saw him standing there, arms crossed. "We need to talk," Chris said, his voice steady but firm. Emily hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "Can it wait? I'm exhausted." "No," Chris said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It can't." She sighed, dropping her purse onto the couch. "What is it now?" Chris motioned to the table, where the photos and documents lay in plain view. "Care to explain this?" Emily's face drained of color as her eyes darted to the evidence. For a split second, Chris saw panic flash across her expression, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "You've been spying on me?" she said, her voice rising. "Unbelievable." "Don't try to turn this on me," Chris shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around with Greg while I've been here holding everything together." Emily's jaw tightened. "Greg is just a friend." Chris slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Don't insult my intelligence, Emily. These aren't pictures of just friends. You're meeting him at a cabin, for God's sake." Emily crossed her arms, her voice turning icy. "And what if I am? What are you going to do about it?" For a moment, Chris was speechless. The woman he had loved for years, the mother of his children, was standing in front of him with an audacity that felt like a slap to the face. But beneath his anger, there was a profound sadness, a grief for the life they had built, now unraveling before his eyes. "This isn't just about us, Emily," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. "This is about Lily and Jack. They deserve better than this." Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't try to play the perfect father card now, Chris. You're no saint." Chris's chest tightened. "I've done nothing but try to make this work. I've sacrificed. I've supported you, and this is how you repay me?" Emily turned away, her shoulders stiff. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I'm tired of this, tired of us. Maybe I wanted something more, something different." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Chris stood there, his mind racing. For years he had believed in their partnership, their family. And now, Emily was dismissing it all as if it were nothing. The next morning, Chris called his lawyer, Melissa. He knew the situation had escalated beyond anything he could handle alone. Melissa listened patiently as Chris laid out the details, from Emily's behavior to the evidence Jennifer had gathered. "This isn't just about infidelity," Melissa said, her tone firm but empathetic. "It's about the stability of your kids' lives. If Emily is prioritizing this affair over her responsibilities as a mother, that's something the court will take very seriously." Chris nodded, gripping the phone tightly. "I just want what's best for Lily and Jack." Melissa assured him they would start building a case for custody, using the evidence as leverage, but she warned him, "Be prepared for a fight. Emily's not going to back down easily." Over the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Emily was distant, her expressions cold and guarded. Chris kept his interactions with her brief, focusing instead on his children. He read to them at night, helped with their homework, and did his best to shield them from the storm brewing between their parents. But Emily wasn't content to let things lie. One evening, after the kids were asleep, she confronted Chris in the kitchen. "So, what's your plan?" she demanded, her arms crossed. "Are you just going to act like this until I leave?" Chris set down the dish he was washing, meeting her gaze evenly. "My plan is to make sure our kids have the stability they need. If you can't provide that, I will." Emily scoffed. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? But you're just as responsible for this mess as I am." Chris shook his head, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about blame, Emily. It's about accountability." Her expression hardened. "You want to fight, Chris Fine? Let's see how the court feels about your little investigation." Chris felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside. He had done nothing wrong, nothing but seek the truth. The breaking point came a week later when Chris discovered that Emily had emptied their joint savings account. The money they had set aside for the kids' future, for emergencies, it was gone. He confronted her immediately, his anger barely contained. "What the hell, Emily? You drained our savings?" Emily shrugged, her tone flippant. "I needed it." "For what?" Chris demanded. "To fund your weekends with Greg?" She didn't answer, and that silence spoke volumes. Chris felt his resolve harden. This wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about protecting his kids from the chaos Emily was creating. Chris met with Melissa again, laying out the latest developments, the drained savings account, the mounting tension at home. It all painted a clear picture. "This is more than enough to build a strong custody case," Melissa said, her confidence reassuring. "But you need to stay calm and focused. Don't let Emily's actions provoke you into making a mistake." Chris nodded. He had spent weeks feeling like a victim, but now he was ready to take control. For Lily and Jack, he would do whatever it took to ensure their safety and stability. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts on this gripping story. What would you do in Chris's shoes? And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. It's about to get even more intense. Chris had reached his limit. The house was no longer a home but a battleground filled with cold stares and veiled accusations. Emily's betrayal wasn't just personal. It was ripping apart the family he had fought so hard to build. But Chris wasn't going to let her selfish choices define their future. After Emily drained the joint savings account, Chris knew it was time to take more concrete action. He returned to Melissa, his lawyer, with the new information. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It had become financial. "Emily's actions aren't just reckless," Melissa said, her tone sharp. "They're dangerous. We'll use this to show the court that she's prioritizing her affair over her family's well-being." Melissa began filing for an emergency financial injunction to prevent Emily from accessing any remaining funds or making large withdrawals. She also advised Chris to file for temporary custody, citing Emily's erratic behavior as harmful to the children's stability. Chris hesitated. "I don't want to take them away from her completely. They love their mom." Melissa softened. "This isn't about punishing her, Chris. It's about protecting your kids. You can still work out a visitation arrangement, but they need a stable home base, and right now, that's you." Emily, predictably, didn't take the legal filings well. She received the papers on a Thursday afternoon and stormed into the house that evening, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you!" she shouted, slamming the door behind her. "You think you can just take my kids away from me?" Chris, who had been helping Lily with her spelling homework, calmly stood and gestured for Lily to go upstairs. "We'll talk later, sweetheart," he said gently. Once the kids were out of earshot, Chris turned to Emily. "This isn't about taking them away from you. It's about giving them stability." "Stability?" Emily scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think dragging lawyers into this is stable?" Chris held his ground. "What's unstable is draining our savings account and sneaking off to a cabin with Greg while your kids wonder where their mom is." Emily's face darkened. "You're pathetic," she spat. "A jealous, controlling man who can't handle that I want more from life." Chris's jaw tightened, but he refused to take the bait. "This isn't about me, Emily. It's about what's best for Lily and Jack." Just when Chris thought things couldn't get worse, a new piece of information surfaced one evening. As he was sorting through the latest batch of legal documents, his phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "You're not going to believe this, but I just heard something about Greg. Call me ASAP." Chris immediately dialed Mark's number, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "Greg isn't just some random guy, Chris," Mark said, his voice tense. "He's married and his wife knows everything." Chris sat down hard, the room spinning. "What?" "Her name's Danielle. She found out about the affair weeks ago and has been gathering her own evidence. She wants to talk to you." Mark sent Chris Danielle's number, and after a few moments of hesitation, Chris dialed. Danielle answered almost immediately, her voice weary but resolute. "I've been waiting for your call," she said. "We need to talk." Chris and Danielle met at a quiet cafe the next day. Danielle was in her mid-30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd been through more than her fair share of hardships. She wasted no time, sliding a folder across the table. "Here's everything I've found," she said. Photos, texts, even hotel receipts. Greg hasn't exactly been careful. Chris flipped through the folder, his stomach twisting as he recognized some of the same evidence Jennifer had gathered. But Danielle's file went deeper, exposing a pattern of deceit that painted Greg as a serial cheater. "Why are you helping me?" Chris asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Danielle's eyes hardened. "Because I'm tired of watching him destroy families. He's done this before, and he'll do it again. If we can work together, maybe we can stop him from doing any more damage." Chris nodded, a newfound resolve settling over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Armed with Danielle's evidence, Chris and Melissa strengthened their case. The photos, messages, and financial records painted a damning picture of Emily's priorities, or lack thereof. But the real turning point came when Danielle agreed to testify. "She'll corroborate everything," Melissa said, her tone filled with quiet triumph. "This isn't just about Emily anymore. It's about the environment she's creating for your kids." Chris felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week, and he knew it would be the most challenging day of his life. The courtroom was tense as Chris and Emily faced off for the first time in front of a judge. Emily's lawyer painted her as a loving mother who had been driven to seek happiness after years of neglect. Chris clenched his fists under the table, biting his tongue as the lies piled up. When it was Melissa's turn, she dismantled Emily's narrative piece by piece. She presented the financial records, the photos, and Danielle's testimony, weaving a story of betrayal and irresponsibility that couldn't be ignored. Danielle took the stand next, her voice steady as she recounted Greg's actions and the impact they had on her family. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confident facade beginning to crack. By the time Chris took the stand, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. He spoke from the heart, focusing not on Emily's betrayal but on his love for his children and his commitment to providing them with a stable, loving home. "I'm not perfect," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "But I will do whatever it takes to make sure Lily and Jack feel safe and loved. They deserve that much." As the hearing concluded, Chris felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The judge announced that she would take time to review the evidence before making a decision, leaving both sides to wait in limbo. Back at home, Chris focused on his kids, trying to shield them from the uncertainty swirling around them. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. He had done everything he could to fight for his family, and now it was in the judge's hands. Don't forget to hit the like button if you're as hooked on this story as I am. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel for the next chapter. It's about to reach its explosive conclusion. Let me know in the comments. What would you do if you were in Chris's position? The tension in Chris's life had reached a boiling point. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of fatherhood, legal battles, and the emotional fallout of Emily's betrayal. The courtroom hearing had left him emotionally drained, but there was no time to rest. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Chris knew the most critical moment was just around the corner. In the days following the hearing, Chris tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home. Lily and Jack were blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them, their laughter a reminder of what Chris was fighting for. He spent his evenings helping them with school projects and bedtime stories, determined to protect their innocence for as long as he could. But Emily's presence in the house was a constant reminder of the battle they were waging. She was colder than ever, her tone sharp and dismissive during their brief interactions. Chris couldn't help but notice the way she avoided looking him in the eye, as though the weight of her choices was finally catching up to her. One evening, as Chris was tucking the kids into bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Melissa. The court date for the final custody decision had been set for the following week. The news hit Chris like a lightning bolt. This was it. The moment that would determine the future of his family. But Emily had other plans. The next morning, Chris woke to find her packing a suitcase in the bedroom. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "What are you doing?" Emily didn't look up. "I'm leaving," she said flatly. "I can't stay here anymore." "Where are you going?" Chris asked, his voice calm but firm. "Does it matter?" she snapped, finally meeting his gaze. "You've made it clear you don't trust me. There's nothing left to talk about. Chris felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly overshadowed by suspicion. "You're not taking the kids," he said, his tone resolute. Emily froze, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Chris said. "If you want to leave, go ahead, but Lily and Jack stay here." Emily's expression hardened. "You don't get to decide that." Chris stepped closer, his voice low but unwavering. "The court will." True to her word, Emily left later that day. She didn't tell Chris where she was going, and he didn't ask. For the next few days, she barely contacted him, leaving Chris to juggle the kids' schedules on his own. But just when Chris thought she might stay gone for good, Emily made a shocking move. Late one evening, Chris heard a car pull into the driveway. He opened the door to find Emily standing there, her arms crossed and a smug smile on her face. Behind her, a man he recognized all too well stepped out of the car. Greg. "What is this?" Chris demanded, his voice tight with anger. Emily smirked. "Greg's here to help me get the kids. You can't stop me." Chris's jaw tightened as Greg stepped forward, his posture cocky. "Look, man," Greg said, his tone condescending. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Emily just wants what's fair." Chris clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wanted nothing more than to throw Greg off his property, but he knew he couldn't afford to lose his cool, not with the custody hearing so close. "You're not taking them," Chris said, his voice firm but measured. "This is their home. If you want to fight for them, do it in court." Emily glared at him, but Greg held up a hand. "Fine," he said. "We'll see you in court." As they drove away, Chris felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. Emily's desperation was escalating, but her recklessness only strengthened his resolve. The days leading up to the final hearing were a blur of meetings with Melissa, preparing documents, and rehearsing testimony. Chris knew the stakes were higher than ever, and he was determined to be ready. Melissa's confidence was reassuring. "We have everything we need," she said during their final meeting. "The evidence, Danielle's testimony, and your dedication as a father. It all works in your favor." Chris nodded, his resolve unshakable. He had spent weeks fighting for his kids, and he wasn't about to back down now. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final custody hearing. Chris sat at his table, his heart pounding as the judge entered and called the session to order. Emily sat across from him, her expression unreadable, while Greg watched from the gallery. Melissa presented their case with precision, laying out the evidence of Emily's affair, financial irresponsibility, and emotional neglect. Danielle's testimony was particularly damning, painting a clear picture of Greg's manipulative behavior and Emily's role in the affair. When it was Emily's turn to speak, her lawyer tried to paint her as a victim of an unhappy marriage, but the argument fell flat. The judge's stern expression made it clear she wasn't buying it. Finally, it was Chris's turn to speak. He took a deep breath and addressed the court, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This isn't about punishing Emily," he said. "It's about giving Lily and Jack the stability they deserve. They're my world, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they feel safe, loved, and supported." After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge finally rendered her decision. The room was silent as she spoke, her voice firm and authoritative. "Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Taylor has consistently acted in the best interests of his children. Therefore, I am granting Mr. Taylor primary custody of Lily and Jack. Mrs. Taylor will have supervised visitation, with the opportunity to revisit this arrangement in 6 months, pending evidence of improved conduct." Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him as the judge's words sank in. He had won, not for himself, but for his kids. Emily stormed out of the courtroom, her face twisted with anger. Greg followed her, his smug demeanor replaced by frustration. But Chris didn't care. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally breathe. Don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Chris's shoes? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this gripping story. It's not over yet. Chris left the courtroom feeling both relieved and exhausted. The battle for custody had been won, but the emotional toll lingered. As he stepped into the bright afternoon sun, he knew the hardest part was over. But the journey ahead, rebuilding a life for himself and his kids, was just beginning. Emily didn't go quietly. In the days following the judge's ruling, she bombarded Chris with angry texts and late-night phone calls. Her words oscillated between venomous accusations and desperate pleas. "You think you've won?" One text read, "This isn't over." Another said, "I miss the kids, you're turning them against me." Chris forwarded every message to Melissa, who reassured him that Emily's behavior only reinforced the court's decision. "Stay calm," she advised. "Don't engage with her unless it's about the kids. Let her show her true colors." Despite Melissa's advice, Emily's unpredictability made Chris uneasy. One evening, she showed up unannounced at his doorstep. The kids were in the living room watching TV, their laughter filling the house, when the doorbell rang. Chris opened the door to find Emily standing there, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with tears. "I need to see them," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to schedule your visits through the court," Chris replied firmly, blocking the doorway. "They're my children too," she cried, her voice rising. "You can't keep me away from them." "Emily, I'm not keeping you away," Chris said, keeping his tone calm but resolute. "You're welcome to see them, under the conditions the court set. Please, don't do this here." Emily glared at him, her emotions bubbling just below the surface. Finally, she turned and stormed back to her car, slamming the door as she drove away. As Chris focused on rebuilding his life, a surprising ally emerged, Danielle, Greg's ex-wife. The two kept in touch after the custody battle, sharing updates on their respective situations. One afternoon, Danielle called with news that made Chris's blood run cold. "Greg's not just a cheater," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "He's dangerous." Chris frowned. "What do you mean?" Danielle explained that Greg had a history of manipulating and exploiting women, often leaving them in financial ruin. "He tried to take out a loan in my name before I caught him," she said, "and I've spoken to 2 other women he's done this to. He uses people until there's nothing left." Chris's mind raced. If Greg was as manipulative as Danielle claimed, Emily could be in serious trouble. Despite everything, Chris didn't want her, or their kids, caught in Greg's web. "Thanks for telling me," Chris said. "I'll keep an eye out." Danielle hesitated. "Be careful. Chris, guys like Greg don't take kindly to being exposed." Meanwhile, life at home began to feel normal again. Chris threw himself into his role as a father, making sure Lily and Jack felt loved and supported. They started a new tradition of Friday movie nights, complete with popcorn and their favorite animated films. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching The Incredibles, Lily turned to Chris and said, "I like it when it's just us, Daddy. It feels happy." Chris smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Me too, sweetheart," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Me too." Slowly but surely the house began to feel like a home again. The laughter returned, and the shadows of the past began to fade. But Emily's spiral continued. Her sporadic attempts to contact the kids grew more erratic, and Chris couldn't ignore the growing reports from Danielle about Greg's behavior. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, Chris received a frantic call from Emily. Her voice was shaky, and he could hear the fear in her words. "Chris, I need your help," she said. "Greg, he's not who I thought he was." Chris gripped the phone tightly, his mind flashing to Danielle's warnings. "What happened?" Emily hesitated before admitting, "He drained my account. Everything I had left, it's gone. And he threatened me when I confronted him." Chris's jaw tightened. Despite everything she had done, he couldn't ignore the mother of his children when she was in danger. "Where are you now?" he asked. "At a friend's place," Emily said, "but I don't feel safe." Chris exhaled slowly. "I'll help you, Emily, but only for the kids' sake." Chris contacted Melissa and Danielle, explaining the situation. They agreed that Greg needed to be held accountable, not just for Emily's sake but for anyone else he might exploit in the future. With Danielle's help, they gathered evidence of Greg's manipulative tactics and presented it to local authorities. Greg's smug confidence crumbled when the police confronted him with the evidence. Danielle's testimony, combined with the financial records, was enough to launch an investigation into his activities. For the first time, Greg found himself cornered. With Greg out of the picture, Emily reached out to Chris, this time with genuine remorse. She showed up at his house one evening, her expression humble and tearful. "I'm sorry, Chris," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For hurting you. For putting the kids through this. I made so many mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Chris studied her for a moment, the anger and betrayal he'd carried for so long softening. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "But the most important thing is making sure the kids are okay. They're what matters now." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As the dust settled, Chris focused on the future. He and Emily established a co-parenting arrangement that prioritized Lily and Jack's well-being. Though their relationship would never be the same, they found a way to work together for their children's sake. Danielle, too, found closure. With Greg facing legal consequences, she began to rebuild her life, grateful for the unexpected bond she had formed with Chris. For Chris, the journey had been painful and full of challenges, but it had also taught him the value of resilience and the importance of standing up for what mattered most. As he sat in the backyard one sunny afternoon, watching Lily and Jack play in the grass, he felt a profound sense of peace. "We're going to be okay," he murmured to himself, a small smile spreading across his face, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. What did you think of this emotional journey? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Chris's shoes? Stay tuned for even more gripping recaps. The storm may have subsided, but Chris knew better than to relax. He had weathered Emily's betrayal and Greg's manipulations, but the aftermath still lingered like a cloud over his family. There were loose ends to tie, trust to rebuild, and most importantly, a life to stabilize for Lily and Jack. But as Chris would soon find out, the story wasn't over yet. Chris thought Greg was out of their lives for good. After the authorities began their investigation, Greg had seemingly disappeared. But just as Chris started to let his guard down, a knock at the door late one evening shattered his fragile sense of peace. Standing on the porch was Greg, his smarmy confidence replaced with something darker. His eyes were cold, his smile threatening. "We need to talk," he said. Chris stepped outside, closing the door behind him to shield the kids from whatever was about to unfold. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Greg leaned casually against the railing, but his posture was anything but relaxed. "You've made my life very difficult, Chris. Getting the cops involved. That was a mistake." Chris crossed his arms, refusing to be intimidated. "You brought this on yourself. Now leave before I call them again." Greg's smile twisted. "You think this is over. You think you've won. I always come out on top." Chris didn't flinch. "Not this time." Greg's smirk faltered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, his parting words echoing ominously. "You'll regret this." The encounter left Chris shaken, but he refused to let Greg's threats derail his progress. The next morning, he reached out to Danielle, who reassured him that they were in this together. "Greg's desperate," she said. "He's losing control, and he knows it." Word of Greg's intimidation spread quickly through their community. Neighbors and friends who had witnessed Chris's struggles over the past months rallied around him. Offers of help poured in, rides for the kids, meals dropped off at the door, even a few discreet tips about Greg's whereabouts. It was a reminder to Chris that he wasn't alone in this fight. Meanwhile, Emily's attitude began to shift. Perhaps it was the realization of what she had lost, or maybe it was Greg's true nature finally coming to light. Whatever the reason, she started taking steps to repair her relationship with Chris, and more importantly, with their kids. One Saturday morning, she showed up at the house during her scheduled visitation time with a box of art supplies and a tentative smile. "I thought we could do some painting," she said, her voice soft. Lily and Jack hesitated at first, unsure of how to react to this new version of their mom. But as the morning went on, the tension eased. By the time Chris came to check on them, the kitchen table was covered in colorful handprints and laughter filled the room. Emily caught his eye, her expression a mixture of gratitude and regret. "Thank you," she mouthed. Chris nodded, but his guard remained up. Actions spoke louder than words, and Emily still had a long way to go. As Chris focused on his family, Greg wasn't idle. He launched a smear campaign, spreading lies about Chris and Emily in an attempt to turn the community against them. Social media posts painted Greg as the victim of a jealous ex-husband and a manipulative ex-wife. He even tried to contact Melissa, claiming Chris had fabricated the evidence against him. But Greg underestimated the strength of the case against him, and the support Chris had garnered. Melissa swiftly shut down his attempts to interfere, and Danielle provided additional testimony that dismantled his credibility. Still, Greg wasn't finished. One evening, Chris returned home to find his car's tires slashed and a threatening note tucked under the windshield wiper. "This isn't over," it read in bold, angry letters. Chris reported the incident to the police, who promised to keep an eye on Greg, but the escalation made it clear that Greg wasn't going down without a fight. The breaking point came late one night when Chris woke to the sound of shattering glass. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone and crept downstairs, dialing 911 as he went. In the dim light, he saw Greg standing in the living room, a crowbar in hand and a wild look in his eyes. "You ruined everything," Greg shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You think you can just destroy my life and get away with it?" Chris held up his hands, keeping his voice calm. "The police are on their way, Greg. You don't want to make this worse." But Greg wasn't listening. He took a step forward, the crowbar glinting menacingly in the light. Chris's mind raced as he positioned himself between Greg and the stairs, where his kids were sleeping. "Think about what you're doing," Chris said, his tone steady despite the fear coursing through him. "This isn't going to fix anything." The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke through Greg's rage. He hesitated, his grip on the crowbar loosening, before bolting out the back door just as the police arrived. Greg's arrest was the culmination of months of tension and turmoil. The charges against him, breaking and entering, destruction of property, and harassment, were enough to ensure he wouldn't be bothering anyone for a long time. Danielle and Chris both testified against him, their combined evidence sealing his fate. For the first time in what felt like forever, Chris could finally exhale. With Greg out of their lives, Chris turned his attention to the future. Emily continued to make amends, attending therapy and rebuilding her relationship with the kids one day at a time. While Chris couldn't fully trust her again, he appreciated her efforts to become a better mother. Danielle, too, found closure in Greg's downfall. She and Chris stayed in touch, their shared experiences forging an unexpected but genuine friendship. For Chris, the journey wasn't just about surviving, it was about rediscovering his strength and resilience. The pain of betrayal had been overwhelming, but it had also revealed the depth of his love for his children and his determination to protect them at all costs. What a ride! Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts on this incredible story. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for more gripping tales of resilience and redemption. Let me know in the comments, how would you have handled Greg's threats? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this inspiring journey. With Greg in custody and Emily taking steps toward redemption, Chris thought the worst was behind him. But life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. Just as Chris began to rebuild a sense of stability, another unexpected twist threatened to unravel everything he had worked so hard to protect. One quiet evening, as Chris helped Lily and Jack with their homework, the doorbell rang. When Chris opened it, he found Emily standing on the porch, her face serious but not hostile. "Can we talk?" she asked. Chris hesitated but stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. They sat at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Emily began, her hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "About what I've done, about the kids, and about us." Chris's jaw tightened. "Emily, if this is about us—" "It's not," she interrupted quickly. "I know I've burned that bridge. This is about co-parenting, about making things right for Lily and Jack." Chris leaned back, his arms crossed. "I'm listening." Emily took a deep breath. "I want to move closer right now. I'm too far away to be as present as I should be. If I move into a place nearby, I can spend more time with the kids and show them I'm trying." Chris studied her for a long moment. Her request was unexpected, but there was sincerity in her voice. "You really think you're ready for that?" he asked. Emily nodded. "I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm willing to do the work. I just need a chance." Chris sighed, his thoughts swirling. On one hand, having Emily closer could complicate things, but on the other hand, the kids deserved a relationship with their mother, one that wasn't limited to supervised visits. "All right," he said finally. "But it's not just about proximity, Emily. It's about consistency. If you're serious about this, you need to follow through." Emily's eyes filled with relief. "I will. I promise." When Chris told Lily and Jack about Emily's plan, their reactions were a mix of excitement and hesitation. Lily clapped her hands together, her eyes bright. "Mom's going to be closer. Does that mean we'll see her more?" Jack, on the other hand, frowned. "But she's not going to live here, right?" Chris knelt down to their level, his voice gentle but firm. "No, Buddy Mom will have her own place, but she'll be nearby. You'll get to see her more often, but this is still your home." Jack nodded slowly. Seeming to accept the explanation, Chris hugged them both tightly, silently vowing to protect their sense of stability no matter what. Despite Greg's arrest, his presence still loomed over their lives. Emily confessed that Greg had contacted her from jail, leaving her rattled. "He's still trying to manipulate me," she admitted during one of their conversations, "but I'm not falling for it this time." Chris's concern grew. Even from behind bars, Greg's reach was unsettling. He and Emily decided to work together to ensure Greg couldn't interfere with their lives any further. They filed restraining orders and worked with the police to monitor his communications. For the first time in a long time, Chris and Emily found themselves on the same side of a battle, a small but meaningful step toward a more amicable relationship. Emily's efforts to rebuild her relationship with the kids began to show results. She attended therapy sessions regularly and made a point to show up for every scheduled visit. One afternoon, she surprised Lily by showing up to her soccer game, cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. After the game, Lily ran up to her, beaming. "You came!" Emily knelt down, tears in her eyes. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss it." Chris watched the scene from a distance, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. He couldn't erase the past, but seeing Emily take steps toward being a better mother gave him a glimmer of hope for the future. Just as life seemed to be settling into a new normal, a letter arrived in the mail that reignited the tension. It was from Greg's lawyer, demanding restitution for what Greg claimed were damages to his reputation and livelihood. The audacity of the claim left Chris furious. Melissa reassured him. "This is a scare tactic. Greg knows he's lost, and this is his last-ditch effort to regain control." But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't done trying to wreak havoc. The idea of facing another legal battle was exhausting, but Chris knew he couldn't back down. Emily surprised Chris by stepping up in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll testify against him again if I have to," she said. "He's hurt enough people, and I won't let him hurt you or the kids anymore." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You'd really do that?" Emily nodded. "I owe it to you and to them." For the first time in years, Chris felt a sense of camaraderie with Emily. They weren't perfect, far from it, but in this moment, they were united. The court date to address Greg's baseless claims arrived with tension. Chris and Emily both testified, presenting evidence that thoroughly discredited Greg's accusations. Melissa's sharp legal strategy left Greg's lawyer scrambling, and by the end of the hearing, the judge dismissed Greg's claims entirely. As the judge delivered the ruling, Chris felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the final nail in the coffin of Greg's influence over their lives. With Greg finally out of the picture, Chris turned his focus fully toward the future. Emily moved into a small apartment nearby and continued her journey toward becoming a better parent. The kids adjusted well to the new arrangement, their laughter and smiles a constant reminder of why Chris had fought so hard. One evening, as Chris tucked Lily and Jack into bed, Jack looked up at him and said, "Dad, I'm glad it's just us again." Chris smiled, his heart full. "Me too, buddy, me too." The story didn't have a perfect ending. Life rarely does. But it was a hopeful one. Chris had learned that resilience isn't about avoiding pain but about rising from it stronger and more determined. His family wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was still his family. and that was enough. As he sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Chris allowed himself a moment of peace. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but he had emerged on the other side stronger than ever. What a journey! If you've been following along, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Let me know in the comments, what do you think Chris's next chapter looks like? Stay tuned for even more incredible tales. The storm had finally passed. Chris stood in his quiet living room, the echoes of laughter and chaos from the past few months fading into memory. His fight to protect his children and rebuild his life had been exhausting, but the journey had also brought clarity. As he stared at a family photo hanging on the wall, he realized how far he had come, not just as a father, but as a person. Greg's downfall was swift and final. After the court dismissed his baseless claims, the investigation into his manipulative schemes continued. Danielle's testimony, combined with Chris's evidence, led to further charges against Greg. He was ultimately convicted of fraud and harassment, ensuring he wouldn't be a threat to anyone else for a long time. For Chris, this wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. Greg's presence in their lives had been a shadow that loomed too large for too long. Now, that shadow was gone, and Chris could finally breathe freely. Emily's journey was one of redemption. Her relationship with Greg had been a wake-up call, forcing her to confront the choices that had led her down such a destructive path. With therapy and the unwavering support of her friends, she began to piece her life back together. More importantly, she focused on being a better mother to Lily and Jack. She never missed a visit, showed up to every school play and soccer game, and made a point of being present in their lives. While her relationship with Chris would never be what it once was, they found a way to co-parent effectively. One day, after dropping the kids off at Chris's house, Emily paused at the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me another chance, for believing I could be better." Chris nodded, his expression soft but guarded. "It's not about us, Emily. It's about them." And for the first time, Emily truly understood. Lily and Jack thrived in their new normal. The emotional upheaval of the past months faded as their parents found a rhythm that worked. They split their time between Chris's house and Emily's apartment, each space filled with love and care. Lily's confidence soared as she excelled in soccer, her mom and dad cheering her on from opposite sides of the field. Jack, ever the curious one, began asking Chris to teach him woodworking in the garage. These small moments of connection reminded Chris why he had fought so hard. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Jack asked, "Are we okay now, Dad?" Chris smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, we're okay." The journey had changed Chris in profound ways. He had learned the value of resilience, the importance of standing up for what mattered, and the strength that comes from leaning on others. He had entered the storm feeling like a victim, but he emerged as a stronger, more self-assured version of himself. Chris also found time to reconnect with old hobbies and friendships. He joined a local running group, something he hadn't done since college, and even started taking photography classes, a passion he had long ignored. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just surviving but truly living. Danielle, too, found peace after Greg's conviction. The closure allowed her to focus on her own healing and her children. She and Chris kept in touch, their shared experiences forging a bond that was both unexpected and meaningful. One afternoon, Chris and Danielle met for coffee, their conversation light but reflective. "You know," Danielle said with a smile, "we're proof that life can throw the worst at you, and you can still come out okay." Chris nodded, raising his cup in a mock toast. "To surviving the storm." Danielle laughed. "And to what comes next." On a crisp autumn evening, Chris sat on the back porch with a cup of tea in hand, watching Lily and Jack chase each other across the yard. The trees were ablaze with color, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. For the first time in a long time, Chris felt truly at peace. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but every step had been worth it. His family wasn't perfect, but it was strong, and that was enough. As the kids ran up to him, laughing and out of breath, Chris pulled them into a hug. "You two are my everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever forget that." "We love you, Dad," Lily said, her arms tight around his neck. Yeah, Jack chimed in. You're the best. Chris smiled, his heart full. In that moment, he knew he had everything he needed. Looking back, Chris realized that the challenges he had faced weren't just obstacles. They were lessons he had learned to trust himself, to fight for what mattered, and to let go of what he couldn't control. Life would never be without its struggles, but Chris now knew he had the strength to face whatever came next. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. If you found Chris's story as inspiring as I did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more stories of resilience and triumph. Let me know in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you took away from this story? Stay tuned for more captivating recaps that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time.